Dr. Kate Beaven-Marks, thank you so much for joining me today on the Professional Hypnotherapist podcast.
Thank you, Aidan. It's lovely to be here.
Well, Dr. Kate, you're a force to be reckoned with. You're a phenomenal resource and force to be reckoned with from being a hypnotherapist to a hypnotherapy trainer, from a conference, so highly sought after conference speaker. You have master's degree and you have a doctorate of education specializing in hypnosis. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm impressed with your research skills. So, yeah, I think I disappointed my supervisor for my doctorate when I told him exactly what I was going to be researching. And then he realized exactly the scope of it, and he was quite excited. So I spent about 6 years sitting in on pretty much every course that I could find to watch how people learn hypnotherapy and how it's taught. And sometimes those two align very nicely, and other times they are miles apart.
Yeah.
So I was incredibly fortunate to spend those years researching. And then I spent 2 years writing it. I maxed out my research time to the day.
Wow.
I got every ounce of value out of it. And then spent 2 years writing up and doing all of the admin bit and being asked questions about my research and stuff.
Wow.
It meant that I had the opportunity to get a really diverse training. I was already a hypnotherapist before I started, but I got to sit in on classes that I might otherwise not have been able to sit in. So, for example, the medical training, it was really interesting to sit in that.
Yeah, excellent. Now, I met you at the Irish Hypnotherapy Conference in Dublin, and it was there that I asked you, well, I thought about, I consider, doing a podcast interview. And I was impressed, and I'm not just saying this because you're sitting in front of me here on the screen. I was really impressed by how kind and generous you are, and how magnanimous you give of your time. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Now, today we're going to talk about therapist self-care. And, I think perhaps this is an area that many therapists out there, whether they be hypnotherapists or indeed psychotherapists or counselors, whatever you want to call it, that in many, many ways, we somehow, we are the carer, but who looks after the carer? So what specifically are we talking about when we talk about therapist self-care?
Well, for context, I think being a hypnotherapist can be quite an isolating experience. You're there with your client. You tend not to be working in a therapy practice with other therapists. So you're on your own. And it's easy to just get up, do your work, get on with your day, and not really notice when something isn't quite right. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah,
With your
thank you.
car, if you drive a car every day, you drive your car, you may not notice that one of your tires is getting a little bit bald. And it's only when you put it in for a service
Yeah.
does somebody else look at it and go, dangerous or unhelpful, or this won't help you get through the winter driving on ice and snow. So this links into therapist self-care. There is a thought, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. And
Yeah.
in a way, I understand that. However, we would still probably service our cars, even though they're not broken down at the side of the road. And actually, good maintenance can prevent problems. So I'm a big fan of self-care, both proactively and reactively. Proactively, doing all of those sensible things that almost become swear words as for self-employed people. And this is the thing. As a hypnotherapist, you're usually self-employed. So you're going to want to work when there's work there.
Yeah.
It might be that you're in a busy time and you've got 9 clients that want an appointment on a Monday, and you know that your threshold is normally 5, but the work's there. And it can be really tempting to just push through and push through and push through. And without realizing it, you can start to get tired, depleted, worn out, even burned out. So it's good to start thinking about the proactive side of maybe having some self-care actually scheduled into your calendar. And that means that it's not going to be depleted. You're not going to be depleted. I always say that as a minimum, give yourself a third of a day every week. So either morning, afternoon, or evening, and that's your self-care time. And that's if you choose to literally just lay in the bath for an hour or sit in the garden with a mug of coffee, just looking at the clouds. But you've got time. It
Yeah.
might even be that you treat yourself as a client and you book in a client appointment for yourself so that you've got time allocated, because if you don't allocate it, life will fill up your schedule. So proactive self-care is one side of it. And I think there's also reactive self-care. And that's where you are able to notice your early warning signs and then do something about it. So there's a lot to self-care, I think.
As, human beings, we have this, what we all know, this self-reflective consciousness, where we reflect and we ponder on what has just happened or what is about to happen. Um, Perhaps you'd comment on the quality of the thoughts, and indeed, as therapists, we know all this, but just from a perspective of self-care, to monitor the quality of our thoughts and how that affects how we feel about ourselves, but not only how we feel about ourselves, but how we feel about what we can do as a hypnotherapist with our clients and etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, totally. I'm a massive fan of reflective practice.
Uh,
So after every client, even if it's just a minute, sitting there and thinking, what did I do? Did I get what I expected? What can I learn from this? And the bit that people often forget, what did I do well? And it's so important to recognize what you did well. That isn't being egotistical. It's actually a part of developing good professional practice. The other element that comes into this, though, is self-talk. And sometimes the therapists that I supervise and mentor have self-talk which isn't helpful. And some people will say, oh, I don't want to get too big for my boots. I don't want to, have a big ego. Self-talk that's critical, that's mean, that's unhelpful is not going to enable you to become the best therapist that you can be. And sometimes people will talk to themselves in a way that if their friend had talked to them like that, there'd be a massive, great big argument. There'd be a falling out. Because how dare you talk to me like that? That's horrible. But actually, what makes it acceptable to talk to yourself like that?
yeah, yeah,
And again, when I think of having a self-care plan, I think it's about sitting down and just every now and then reflecting, how do I talk to myself? Where are the areas where I'm most critical? And actually, then you come into the whole cognitive side of things. Is there any evidence for that? Because if there is, if I'm not particularly good, say, at timekeeping, luckily I'm okay. But if I'm not particularly good at timekeeping, then what do I need to put into place? So can I be practical about this? If there's evidence for it, then that negative self-talk is actually useful to get you to do something about it. If it's not evidence, and if it's just one of those negative habits that you've got into, then it's worth asking yourself, how does it help? How does it help you to beat yourself up over something that isn't evidenced? Is it actually going to help you become a better therapist? Is it going to help you live a happier life? And if it isn't, then it's down to good old-fashioned habit change. And every time you hear yourself saying something negative, go, no, actually, my timekeeping is adequate. And just correcting it. And I think that works really well over time.
Excellent. I always, ask how big is the stick you have to beat yourself with, you know? No, excellent. I love the way, I mean, you give us something to ponder about there and valuable stuff. Um, Perhaps you'd comment from your perspective on the benefits of supervision.
Yeah, supervision is an area that you might have guessed already I'm really fond of.
Sorry, can I just clarify? May I just clarify? When we say, I beg your pardon, when we say supervision, what specifically do we mean?
That's a great point, really. So supervision can come from any or several routes. Classically, we think of supervision as speaking with somebody trained as a supervisor, perhaps, but who's more experienced than you are, or has a different, perhaps a broader perspective than you have. And that's your classic one-to-one supervision. Now, personally, I grew up with having to do a supervision hour with my supervisor. And when I first started out, I thought that was a terrible waste of money because I'd have one client and I'd go and chit chat about my one client and then we'd just gossip for 45 minutes. It's like, I'm paying to gossip. This is not good value for me. And I think that's where sometimes people fall out of the supervision habit. I know when I do supervision to the people I supervise, I just do it in 15-minute chunks of time. So they pay for what they want and, you get in, you focus on what you want, you stop. And it works a lot better, I think. But there's more to supervision than just one-to-one. Group supervision gives you a different dynamic. And there's different supervision groups all over the place. I do one that's online. And we have between 4 and 8 therapists, sometimes even experienced students coming in. And we start off with a case to warm everybody up, just to get the mind working. And then everybody presents a case that they're working on, maybe a marketing or business query. And all of the people there dive in with their thoughts on it. And group supervision gets a different perspective to the individual. And I think it isn't an either or. I think there's places for both of them. There's also peer supervision, which I think is useful. Although with peer supervision, I don't think it's all that there is. I think you need the others as well. So peer supervision is where you're speaking to perhaps the people that you trained with. So they understand the techniques that you're talking about, and they may well have worked with a client like you. You might have, Michael who's coming in and he's really stuck improving his golf game. He's got imposter syndrome and you're really not sure how to progress with him. You've done the usual, you've done parts therapy and done a bit of cognitive work. And you might take it to a group of your peers and say, have you had anything like this? What did you do that worked? Or what did you do that really didn't work? Both of which are useful bits of information. So peer supervision can be really handy as well. And ideally, you've got access to all three. And then you can pick from those what it is. I would say sometimes be careful about using Facebook as your only form of supervision, because not everybody there will have the same agenda. Sometimes people have a brand or a model on Facebook and their answers will be flavoured to suit their brand or model. So they
Yes.
might be super controversial as part of their brand, and their answers have to align with their brand if they're on social media for them. So having alternatives to that can be useful. But supervision overall, very helpful.
Yeah. And not only helpful, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, valuable, where would you rate it?
Oh,
Where?
11.
11. Excellent. Yeah, yeah. That's very excellent. Okay. Now, what type of questions, we're today we're talking about self-care, therapist self-care. What are the questions, we may have touched on it earlier, that we should be asking ourselves as hypnotherapists, or what specifically, to get down into the nuts and bolts of it, do we need to be really, conscious of?
I think you mentioned about reflection earlier,
Yeah,
and I think something to be really conscious of is to spend a moment before you start therapy with a client and be aware of what you're going into that session with. What's your stuff? What emotions are you feeling? What are
yeah,
you feeling within your body? What are you taking into
yeah.
that therapy space?
Hmm.
And then at the end of the session, check in with yourself again.
Yeah,
And what are you feeling? And what's your stuff? And what might you have picked up from your client? And having a method of letting go of what you've picked up from your client is really useful. Whether that's you're writing up your post-session notes, and that's your point at which you draw a line, you have a break, and you move on, or whether it's you use a formal technique, whatever you choose to do, but having this system, this checking in is really useful. And again, as part of your proactive self-care, if you can schedule some time to maybe just sit down and have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, sit in the garden, go for a walk and
yeah,
check in with yourself.
mm,
How are you feeling?
yeah, yes,
Because we get caught up with life. You have to get up and do things and get through your day, and you don't always have time to just sit there and think, well, how am I feeling? Am I excited to see the next client? Or is it a case of, are you clock watching
yeah,
and thinking, oh gosh, I've got so much I want to do with this client. I've only got 45 minutes left. Or are you thinking, oh, 45 minutes with this client. Oh, I can't bear it. It's where you are, or
yeah,
somewhere in between those two extremes. So checking in is so important as part of self-care, I think.
yeah. Excellent. And, I come from I suppose, a school of hypnotherapy that is hypnoanalytical, and that was well, 30 years ago at this stage. And, the emphasis was always on, transference and countertransference and supervision. So I can get where you're coming from and important because I am concerned that, out there that there are people operating in the world as therapists and they never even think about supervision. It doesn't even come into their model of the world, you know?
I know, it makes me think of somebody that very in the early days I learned from, and they ended up being one of my supervisees, which was very bizarre in some way. And I was chatting with him about his work, and he presented, I think, 5 different cases. And I knew that at the time, because he told me that he
This
was
is
going,
Eric from, is it?
sorry?
Is this Eric from? Is that what
No,
you said?
no. This chap that I was
Oh,
supervising,
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
yeah, he was having relationship issues with his wife,
Okay.
and he was presenting his cases. And one was an OCD, one was a phobia, one was issues at work. They were very distinctly different cases. And yet, when he reported how he'd focused his therapy, all 5 were treated for relationship issues. Now, was that the way any other therapist would have gone? Possibly not. Could it have been that he was treating those clients in the way that he wanted to be treated himself?
Yeah.
Now, he may never have spotted that with reflection because he's looking through the situation with particularly focused glasses. In supervision, a supervisor can pick up the big picture. They can look at trends. They can look at what's underlying the behaviour. And is there transference that they're responding to? Is there counter-transference?
Yes.
Is there something behind their choices for how they conduct therapy? Because the hypnotherapy world is vast, and generally there is no single right or wrong way to conduct therapy. We use over 200 different psychotherapy models. So put 10 people in a room with one client and they will likely all come up with different ways that would be equally successful, but just different. So supervision can be very helpful. And I love the fact that you come from an analytical background. So well done, you.
Well, thank you. There are many, many, many of us around, indeed. And it was always the case, where that, you always had a supervisor, and you have a supervisor, and as from the perspective of the EAPH, the European Association, we're a sort of a self-governing body where we have rules and regulations, and members must have had training in hypnoanalysis and subscribe to the and engage with a supervisor. Do you think, Kate, do you think that hypnotherapy will ever achieve or get the credit it actually needs in terms of the mainstream orthodoxy that's out there for there to be psychologists and medical area? Do you think we'll ever get any type of recognition or accreditation?
So, a great question. I don't think it will ever be legislated. I don't think it will ever have the type of statutory regulation. And
Yeah.
actually, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Okay.
Because what will happen if we had statutory regulation is that all of the dodgy ones would just call what they do something different. So they
Okay.
wouldn't be caught by statutory regulation anyway.
I
That's
love it. Love it.
funny. I
Thank
was speaking to somebody on Friday in the hypnotherapy world,
you. Uh-huh.
and he was saying, what do you stand for? And I'm really passionate about standards, truly passionate about
Yeah.
standards. So, Kate, nobody's interested. And in a way, it is true. People aren't interested in standards until there's a problem.
Yeah.
And then we look into it. I'm on the board with the Complementary and Natural Healthcare Council and representing hypnotherapy. So from time to time, I get to write expert opinions on cases where people have been complained about.
Yes.
And a lot of this does come down to communication and people not necessarily communicating the standards that they have within their therapy practice. So standards, I think, are important. Recognition is an interesting area. I was really fortunate to be invited to present at the 22nd World Congress for Clinical and Medical Hypnosis in Krakow this year. And I was surprised at where their general level of training was compared to our standard level of hypnotherapy training. And that really did surprise me. Some of the basics that my students would have on weekend one of a training course, they hadn't been exposed to. So I think that is something, part of this, I think, is also the fact that as hypnotherapists, we don't work to make hypnotherapy visible. Every few days, I hear somebody talk about the work they did, and they'll say, "Oh, I just said it was a guided visualization." If hypnotherapists won't stand up and call what they're doing hypnotherapy, we're never going to get all of these positive outcomes recognized as being associated with hypnotherapy. And even Michael Yatko wrote about that, I think in Trance Works,
Yeah.
saying that hypnotherapy has this vast body of evidence, but people aren't actually calling it hypnotherapy. And I don't know whether it's the case now. I haven't checked recently, but I think it was the College of Anaesthetists had some recordings up that were actually hypnotherapy to help people prepare for surgery, but they called them guided visualizations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if they're not standing up and saying, "Oh, we're using hypnotherapy," if they think that there's something dodgy about it, then we're not going to get the public recognizing how powerful hypnotherapy is.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's a powerful methodology to help clients, and indeed, hypnosis and hypnotherapy is not magic, but yet the results are magical. And keeping in the whole theme of self therapist self-care and the ethical background that we all must, I know you agree that we all must have within our wheelhouse, as it were. Um, Perhaps you comment on the importance of note taking.
Oh, I really like where you're going with this. So you mentioned I just mentioned about being an expert opinion writer. Oh my gosh, if only you took good notes, it would make such a difference. I think there's a couple of things here. It's really important to take good notes to protect yourself as a therapist, but also they're an invaluable learning tool. Really invaluable. One thing that I suggest everybody practices is writing without looking. Yeah.
Interesting.
So being able to have a notepad by your side and
Yeah.
being able to write notes without actually looking down. So you're not breaking rapport, looking down at your notes, but you're just making a note. It's super easy when you're working online because all you need to do is to open up a Word document, treat yourself to a silent keyboard and a silent mouse, and then you can take notes all the way through and your client isn't even going to notice. So you can take superb notes that way. But note taking is really, really important, not just at the intake, but as you go through, because clients will often, Erickson and Carl Rogers and so many other people say that the client has the answer within them. And actually, it is true. The client often will say something and you think, "Oh, wow." And then a few minutes later, they'll say something else. And if you jot down these little gems, these moments of insight, even if it's at the end of a session and you're reviewing your notes, you can start to build a picture, which gives you a really great starting point for the next session. So note taking is incredibly important. I think it's also important these days, sadly, so that if your client does come back to you and says, "Oh, well, it didn't work and you didn't tell me what hypnosis was like," you can actually refer to your notes and say, "Well, we discussed this and you said this, and then I said that and you said that." It doesn't have to be verbatim, but then generally clients can forget as well. So
Yes.
having this information can be very useful for you. But from an insight perspective, note taking can be such a valuable tool as well.
No, I just want to counter something, if I may, and just purely just in the interest of of getting to the good argument or good material so that we can all chew on it, as it were. There is a group out there or people out there who would say, look, well, I don't take notes because I don't want to end up in court. And anyway, if I ended up in court, you know, the the lawyer for the opposition would completely diss me because I'm just a hypnotherapist. I'm not a recognized professional out there in terms of from a university, that's legislated for, as we spoke on earlier. Would you comment on that, please?
You're not working as a psychologist, you're working as a hypnotherapist.
Hmm.
So be honest about the work that you're doing, and
Yeah,
don't give people the impression that you're working in a psychological or psychotherapy field if you're using hypnotherapy. But you can get called into court whether you've got good notes or not. What would you want to have? Do you want to have good notes that support you? Or do you want to go into court and say, oh, well, I didn't take notes?
yeah,
That's not going to stop you going to court.
no,
It is incredibly rare that hypnotherapists will end up in court. Incredibly rare. But it's more likely that somebody will complain about you, particularly if you haven't got a good record system, if things aren't organized. And if you're not a note taker, you may not have good admin systems. So, for example, you may not have a good method of checking that you've got a therapy contract.
yeah,
And if you haven't got stuff like that, how can you demonstrate to a client, and how do you even know that they have an understanding of what to expect? And really commonly, people seem to get complained about because the information about what hypnosis is and isn't, the whole pre-talk and all of the bit that goes before, wasn't understood. People still watch movies and think that hypnosis is you're fixed, you're
yeah,
cured,
yeah.
walk out healed.
Mm,
And it isn't the case. And clients need to be able to give informed consent. And
yes.
that includes, knowing what hypnosis is and what it isn't. And whilst I'm firmly in agreement, I think it was London in 1947 said, don't dispel myths that are helpful.
Yeah.
So if people think that they've got to work hard to get a positive outcome, that could be useful. But do dispel myths that are unhelpful and make sure that your client has an understanding of what hypnosis actually is before you even get started.
And you touched on it there, the whole area on the importance of having a therapy contract. I think that's really important also. And indeed, the EAPH.ie, we would insist or we would demand that, you know, our client or our therapists perhaps would have a contract. Um, what do you say to somebody out there? Say, well, sure, everything's on my website, you know.
Show me the evidence that your client has interacted with your website.
Mm,
Maybe they haven't got access to your website. Maybe they don't remember. I would also say, let me give you a bit of paper and get you to sign it. Are you going to sign it without reading what's on that paper? And I think 99 people out of 100 would insist on reading what's on that piece of paper, and the other
yeah,
one out of the 100 would at least glance at it before signing it. A therapy contract ensures, as much as you possibly can, that doing your due diligence, that your client has read and understood what they're committing to.
mm,
I think a therapy contract protects the therapist and the client, but it also is a valuable tool in achieving change. Because when people sign something, they commit to it. They've put their name on it. So
definitely.
it elevates their perception of what they're engaged in.
Excellent. I love it. I think it's really, really important that to be um, as professional as one possibly can be, and to have the standards to have the highest possible standard in your work is essential. And thank you for all of this today, Kate, because I found it really, really beneficial, and I know that our viewers and listeners out there will find this also beneficial. Is there anything else that you really believe or feel that is important in the area of therapist self-care that we need to mention here today?
I think there's just so much. Ironically, or perfect planning. Last night, I actually launched an online course on self-care for therapists. I did
Wonderful.
write it weeks ago, just saying. Um, and that's on hypnosiscourses.com. And what I found in writing that
Yeah,
is that it's about finding the things that work for you. So I'm suggesting that you schedule time into your calendar, and it might be that the day before you just go, you know what, I'm checked in with myself, I feel fine, I don't need to use that time. But scheduling time in, I do think it's so important to have both proactive and reactive strategies, which is why
excellent.
I put both of those into the training. I
Yeah,
also put some stuff in there for hypnosis because you know what, as hypnotherapists, how often do we get hypnotized? So the final thing that I would say is if you can get together with a peer who you're happy to work with, and every now and then have a therapy swap and actually sit down in the client chair and be a client and work through the stuff that you would benefit working through. Because life happens to all of us.
yeah,
And it's really good to be able to engage. I say working with a peer because it's a really good way of having ongoing care rather than popping in and seeing a therapist and you having to build rapport with somebody new. Working with a peer tends to be really effective. You've already got that level of trust, mutual understanding. And that way it can also be a growth experience for both of you.
it's growth experience, and that's a wonderful way to bring this really awesome podcast to a close.
Yeah.
I'll say till the next time. And Kate, Dr. Kate, how can we contact you? How can people contact you?
Um, Very easy. You can find Kate Beaven-Marks. It's Beaven, commonly misspelt. So Kate Beaven-Marks on Facebook. You can find me on hypnotc.com, which is hypnotc.com, and also hypnosiscourses.com. So you can contact me via any of those emails, and I'm more than happy to speak with anybody. If they've got any queries about self-care, then feel free to get in contact and we can chat.
Wonderful. So that was Kate, Dr. Kate Beaven-Mark. Um, I won't say anything more. This was just superb. And you can check out everything. And indeed, I put all the links in the notes below for this podcast, along with the transcript. Dr. Kate, thank you so much. Until next time.
You are more than welcome, Aidan. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you.